The tales you're about to hear are not for the faint of heart. Handpicked from across the web, they come from those who claim to have lived through experiences that defy logic. Whether you believe them or not is up to you, but for those who shared them, these encounters feel hauntingly real. So get cozy, settle in, and if you're ready, let's begin. I grew up attending a small church with a lot of history, some good, some unsettling. The building was old, creaking with time and stories, and the congregation often whispered about strange happenings over the years. As a kid, I always chalked it up to overactive imaginations or urban legends, but one day I experienced things that made me question everything. It started with a thumbtack. I was in the church, walking past a poster pinned to the wall, when suddenly the tack holding it up shot across the room, flying a good 15 feet away from me. It didn't fall or get brushed off. It was as if someone had ripped it out and hurled it. Later that same day, we heard a woman crying in the old nursery. The sound was unmistakable. Young, heartbroken sobbing, complete with hitched breaths. When we went to investigate, the room was empty. The crying stopped the moment we stepped inside. Not long after, one of us went to the bathroom. When he came back, he looked shaken and said he'd felt chills running up and down his back, like someone was lightly touching his shoulder. And then there were the odd encounters upstairs. At one point, an older woman enthusiastically greeted a little girl playing alone with, "Hi." The rest of the kids had stayed home that day, so we'd been keeping an eye on her. The staircase was right behind us, so we knew nobody else had gone up. But when we checked, the room was empty. The little girl just shrugged when we asked about it and went back to playing with her toys. These incidents weren't isolated. Other members of the congregation had their own eerie stories. Some talked about an old pastor who resigned in the mid-90s. According to them, he wasn't a righteous man and played a large role in a bitter schism that divided the church. There were unsettling rumors about his conduct with younger girls, though nothing was ever proven. Two elderly women who were around back then told a chilling story about his final Sunday sermon. As they described it, the sanctuary doors flew open mid-service, and a dark figure, a demon, entered. It moved slowly, locking eyes with the congregation as it crept down the aisle. When it reached the pulpit, it turned its gaze on the pastor. Then, it picked up the offering plate, dumped its contents onto the floor, and walked back to the entrance. The sanctuary doors shut, and the figure walked straight through them, literally passing through the closed doors. The pastor resigned the following Friday. Unlike the other events, I wasn't there for that one, but I heard it from so many people that it felt just as real. Years later, I spoke to a Hispanic family that left the church after the schism. They confirmed the story, saying it was the moment they decided to start their own congregation. To this day, I don't know what to believe. All I know is that old building had a way of making the hair on the back of your neck stand on end, no matter how much you tried to dismiss it. One time, I was napping in my room with my 2-year-old son. I was lying on my left side, with both arms wrapped securely around him. Suddenly, I heard an incredibly loud, raspy old woman's voice growl. As I heard the voice, my right arm was wrenched off my son and flung violently behind my back. My son woke up, confused and disheveled, and I was left completely disoriented and flabbergasted. I was freaked out, but tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was sleep paralysis, my imagination, or just a strange dream. I brushed it off as best as I could and tentatively moved on. About 6 months later, my sisters, their boyfriends, my boyfriend, and I were sitting around outside, swapping stories about weird experiences. When it was my turn, I told them about the wake-up incident. As I finished, I glanced over at my boyfriend, and to my shock, he had tears in his eyes and looked genuinely rattled. I asked him what was wrong. He took a deep breath and explained that on that same day, he had been in the living room when he heard the exact same thing, a loud, raspy old woman's voice yelling, "Wake up!" It was so loud and so close that he immediately got up and searched the entire house, inside and out, convinced an old woman had somehow broken in and snuck back out. My boyfriend isn't the type to believe in ghosts. He's a total skeptic. But the voice he heard was so strange, so vivid, that it stuck with him for months. Hearing me describe the same thing completely shook him. He couldn't understand how it happened, and it really messed with his head. After my son was born, odd things started happening around the house, though we hadn't thought much of them at the time. Curtains would open or close on their own. We'd hear knocking, banging, scratching sounds, and even strange, growling voices. Faucets and lights would turn on and off by themselves, and random electronics would power up or down without explanation. My son often woke up terrified, screaming hysterically in the middle of the night. We chalked it up to him being a baby, but as he got older, he started telling us someone was in his room. He refused to sleep unless I stayed with him, watching over him. We dismissed these incidents as random oddities, things that couldn't be explained but didn't necessarily seem paranormal. But after talking about the sleep incident, we began piecing everything together. The more we openly discussed it, the more we started to wonder if something truly paranormal had been going on all along. That realization shook my boyfriend to his core. I'll never forget the look on his face. Absolute fear, raw and unfiltered. Even now, over 10 years later, I can still remember how freaked out he was. It's a memory that hasn't lost its grip on me, even after all this time. For a little more info, this all took place in a small mining town in Colorado. Mining towns are notorious for having some strange activities. This town specifically was situated between two larger towns. It was made up of homes from an older settlement that had actually burned to the ground in the mid to late 1800s. An entire town, housing roughly 10,000 people, practically vanished entirely after a party erupted into fire one evening. The remaining 20 homes were all relocated into the town I resided in over a period of 30 years or so in the early 1900s. The town has a large granary with a railroad that follows alongside the length of the town. The town's only about 2 miles long. It's tiny. We walked it many nights as it was something to do. Next to the granary, there was a railroad crossing that allowed you to go out the north side of town. A few homes on that side were followed by the Yampa River. We had a few lady friends who lived on that side of the railroad that we visited often. As a group of boys, late at night of course, we would always try to convince the girls to come walk around with us, often followed by a no. This evening we got lucky and they chose to sneak out. We eventually made our way down to their houses around 11 p.m., gathered them up, and then headed back to our friend's house, where we all hung out and listened to music for a few hours. The later the evening went on, the more paranoid the girls became. So, around 2 a.m., we decided to take them back to their homes. It was a 10-minute walk or so. When we started the walk, we noticed a woman in white walking alone down the road by our buddy's house. This late in a small town, it wasn't something you'd see often, but being kids, we thought nothing of it. We just assumed someone was having a rough night and went for a walk. As we descended the hill in town, it was a straight shot looking about 2 blocks toward the railroad crossing. We noticed what seemed to be the same woman in white, pacing along the railroad, only visible in the dim yellow light illuminating the small rail intersection. We all stopped for a moment because we realized this was the same woman we had seen walking in the opposite direction at the top of the hill just 5 minutes earlier. We continued following the road, and she seemed to notice us. She began walking toward us. At this point, we all had suspicions, but we hadn't assumed anything. Between us and her was the main road in town and 2 smaller roads before the railroad crossing. The only areas with light were the main road and the crossing, so it was rather dark for a large chunk of the way. As we approached the main road, we noticed she was still walking by the railroad, but hadn't moved very far, as if she was walking in place. At this point, we all became suspicious. Within 300 feet of her, she started to actually move towards us and then stepped into the darkness, where she vanished before our eyes. All 7 of us, already scared by the sight of her, pacing back and forth, began searching the dark area for traces of this woman. We found nothing, no one, no signs of life whatsoever. All the homes were dark, the railroad was empty, and the granary was the only place left to check. We decided to take the girls on past the railroad and back to their homes before further investigating the granary. We came up short there, too. Strangely enough, though, we did hear faint music coming from the second story of the granary, almost like vinyl tracks. The second story was vacant and hadn't been occupied for at least a decade. All in all, it was a strange experience, and our first encounter with this woman in white. Less than a month later, we had our second encounter, which I've already gone into detail about before. Strange town, strange things, and most of all, spooky. I was around 7 or 8 years old when my grandfather took me and my brother to the park one day. After a while, we came home, full of energy, and rushed to the front door while my grandfather unlocked it. Being a curious kid, I peeked through the living room window and froze. Inside, I saw a little girl. She looked a bit younger than I was, with blonde hair styled in pigtails tied with pink ribbons. She wore a pink dress and matching slippers. At first, I wasn't concerned. I thought maybe she was a neighbor's kid who had somehow wandered inside. But then, I noticed her leg. It was in the couch. Not on it. In it. As if she was half sunken into the fabric. I immediately told my grandfather I saw a little girl in the living room. Being ex-military, he made my brother and me stay outside while he did a sweep of the first floor. When he didn't find anything, he got mad, accusing us of watching or reading too many ghost stories. Later that day, I told my aunt about the little girl I'd seen. She paused, then asked, was she wearing a pink dress or a yellow one? When I said pink, she described the girl I saw in almost perfect detail. Then she told me something that made my stomach drop. There wasn't just one girl. According to her, there were two, the younger blonde in pink and an older brunette in yellow. This wasn't the only strange thing tied to that house. My other aunt often talked about their family dog and how it used to run around in the basement like it was playing with someone. She even managed to film its tail being lightly pulled, as if by an unseen hand, before it turned to keep playing with nothing. I don't know if that footage still exists, probably buried on an old camera or long-forgotten laptop, but it's one of those things I wish I could get my hands on to prove that I wasn't crazy for seeing that girl in pink. It wasn't just me, though. The house had a reputation in my family. My dad, my aunts, and even my grandparents had all experienced creepy things there. When they first moved in, this was about 40 years ago, the house came with an old piano. At first, they thought it was a charming addition, but they quickly realized it wasn't so charming when it started playing itself at night while they tried to sleep. Eventually, they had enough. They chopped the piano into pieces, burned it in the backyard, and had the house blessed. There's one more story from my family that's even harder to believe. According to my aunt and grandparents, my eldest aunt was possessed at birth. She was born on a British military base in Germany, which, let's be honest, sounds like the kind of place that might attract some dark energy. I don't know what to make of that claim, and since she's the oldest, I can't ask my dad for details. Plus, all her records are from Germany, so digging into it would be almost impossible. I can't say for certain what's real and what's not, but when I think back to that little girl in pink and the way my aunt described her, I can't shake the feeling that some things, no matter how unbelievable, leave us scarred. After moving out of our haunted rental house in 1985, we bought a cottage in Sound Beach, New York. The house had originally been a summer cottage with no basement, so when oil heat was added, a 6 by 12 foot attached room was built. It was accessible only from the outside and housed the oil burner, hot water tank, and washer and dryer. I added 2 freestanding shelving units in there since the house had only one closet. We used those shelves for tools, games, and other items we didn't need often. One of those games was a Ouija board, still in its box. We'd bought it at a garage sale and tried using it a couple of times in our previous house, but nothing had ever happened. One evening, around 10 p.m., we heard a deafening banging noise from the boiler room. It was so loud that at first I thought the oil burner might have exploded, or maybe someone had kicked the door in. Our 3 dogs went absolutely berserk, barking and pacing frantically. I started putting on my shoes when my wife urged me to stay inside and call the police, but, of course, I couldn't resist going to check. I grabbed a large butcher knife, probably a poor choice if an intruder had a gun, but I figured it might at least scare someone off. I also grabbed the key to the room since we kept that door locked, unless we were doing laundry. As I opened the kitchen door, my wife was pleading with me to wait and call the cops. I stepped outside, closed the back gate behind me, and slowly approached the laundry room at the back of the house. The door was shut. That ruled out someone kicking it in. I hesitated at the door. Could the boiler have exploded? Could someone have snuck in to sleep there? The previous owner was a minister who had allowed homeless men to stay in that room, so it wasn't out of the question. I took a deep breath, slid the key into the lock, and slowly turned the knob. With one swift motion, I flung the door open and jumped back, bracing myself for, well, I wasn't sure what. The room was undisturbed except for one thing. There, on the floor, was the Ouija board, face up, with the planchette perfectly centered as if ready to be used. The empty box lay nearby. Somehow, this game, and only this, had fallen from the 3rd shelf. The board and planchette had landed just so, almost as if to say, "Bring me inside and use me." So of course I yelled back to my wife that everything was fine, that it was just a box that had fallen. I picked up the Ouija board and its box, carried them straight to the trash can by the curb, snapped the board in half so it couldn't be used again, and threw it away. When I went back inside to explain what had happened, my wife looked at me in disbelief. "There's no way just a Ouija board made a noise that loud," she said. I agreed. It didn't make sense, but I shrugged it off. "It's gone now," I said. Having just moved out of our haunted house in Port Jefferson, I couldn't shake the fear that something had followed us. Thankfully, nothing else paranormal, or possibly paranormal, ever happened in that house after the Ouija board incident. And with that, we close the door on tonight's stories. If you enjoyed them, please support me by hitting that like button and subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe and take care.